Actually, on this computer, it's usually easier to upload. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and so that you can see where the review is going to be, as well as I'll probably be referencing my own review just a couple of times. So I don't know why it decided to take me. Let me exit out of here. I think that's Mozilla. Yeah. Okay. So if you're not sure where to find the review, oops, go over here. It's going to be underneath the content browser if you haven't seen it yet. So if you are not aware, underneath the content browser, I did upload where it says test2review. If you are not looking at that right now, I would suggest going ahead and pulling that up, maybe downloading it as I'm talking, and then writing in or typing into it. So that way you have it for your future reference. Now, I will upload the video of this conversation, like I said, so that you will have this. I'll post a news story up in D2L once we're finished talking today, so that you have a reference for what's on the review and what all you can expect on the test, okay? I might not be able to see, if I pull up this review so that I can see what's on it, I might not be able to see your screens. So if you have a question, if you would either send that to the chat where I can see a little message pop up that tells me that you're asking me a question, or open your microphone so that I know that you're trying to talk, okay? All right, so, some of the things that you need to know for Emil Berliner. Basically, he is associated with the invention of the gramophone. I do have written there flat disk for gramophone, but just if you know generally that he is associated with the gramophone, you should be okay. Joseph Maxfield is well known for inventing 78 RPM records, which often were used in jukeboxes. You have a man named Elridge Johnson, who actually, with Emil Berliner, was responsible for creating what's called the Victor Talking Machine Company. So they actually sold phonographs. Then you have Peter Goldmark, who is, he famously invented, I believe it was the 33 1/3 inch record. But he is another one that is famous for inventing records. He invented what is called the long play or LP record. So in the early days when you had 78 RPMs or 45 RPMs, they were a little bit smaller, and then Peter Goldmark comes out with this format that's you see in the, let me see if I can actually bring that up. Here we go. This is from chapter 5. Let me minimize y'all for just a second. Okay. So if you see in chapter 5, right here, yeah, so sorry about that. Okay. Yeah, it was 33 1/3 RPMs. And so there he is with that big stack of LP records next to a bunch of 78 RPM records, which obviously could not hold quite as much content on them. Okay, all right, back to the review. Thomas Edison, I do want you to know that he is considered responsible for at least patenting, if not inventing, the phonograph, right? As far as the at work and sections and roles, so we're in chapter 5 right now, just in case you're curious, this is in recordings, but do know all of the at work sections. So like, remember that the marketing and promotion is exactly what it sounds like. You have artists and repertoire, which is basically like talent scouts. So just review that section in your book, as always. With David Sarnoff, remember, he is going to be the head of a company called RCA. And one of the things you probably do want to remember about RCA that I don't actually have on this review is that RCA was formed out of what's called a patent pool. So there are about 5 different companies, including Western Electric and Westinghouse and a couple of other recording industry giants at the time, and they all pooled their patents together, meaning that they shared a bunch of stuff that they had about recording devices, so that they could sell their own recording Who can see this? Oh, I'm sorry. That's not a question. That's just who can see this transcript. Okay. In any case, RCA was a patent pool. It came out of, whoever wanted to pool their patents together and start selling their recording equipment. David Sarnoff also wanted to play. He wanted to sell records that played 45s. He didn't really like William Paley's LPs, so he wanted to compete directly with William Paley, who was trying to sell recording equipment that would play those LPs that Peter Goldmark came up with. And so those two compete for quite a while. And then also remember that David Sarnoff, obviously associated with RCA now, but it'll become NBC in the future. Okay, licensing companies. Remember that there were, ASCAP was the original sort of music licensing company. They would sell, I think it was $200 a year that you had to pay ASCAP in the early days. Usually that was going to be for classical music, sheet music, stuff like that, so that whenever you played an artist over the air, you owed them a certain amount of money. If it was one of the artists whose sheet music they owned the rights to. And then a bunch of people, especially in more so like the Motown and the rock and roll era, more radio stations started deciding that that was too big of a fee to pay on your own. And so a lot of different radio stations decided, well, if we each pay a smaller fee, but we all pay it at the same time, that would be easier to license. And that is where you get BMI. So BMI is the other music licensing company. Berry Gordy, what you need to know about Berry Gordy is simply that he invented Motown. Alan Freed is associated with rock and roll radio, so he was a big rock and roll disc jockey. And when I get down to, we're going to talk about payola for a second, and Alan Freed is also associated with a payola scam. So I'll tell you that in just a second. Frank Conrad. What I need you to know about Frank Conrad is that he created the first commercial, quote unquote, radio broadcast. Remember, we brought this up in class. The commercial part does not actually mean commercial. It means that, excuse me, it just means that it's the first radio station that was really broadly available to the public. So Frank Conrad had KDKA, which was the first publicly available or commercial, quote unquote, radio station. Where I put top earners in the review, what I really just need you to know for that, if you would review chapter 5's PowerPoint, and I've put for the year of 2021 was the most recent. So this is just making sure you were paying attention in class. So like the Rolling Stone were the top money-making musicians in 2021. And then I updated, I think 2022, you had Elton John and Bad Bunny as far as some of the top grossing concerts of most recent memory. So just kind of have a general idea of some of the top earners. So most likely the options that you'll see are going to relate to whoever was most popular in 2021 or 2022 based on those PowerPoints. So that's more of a make sure you're paying attention in class type of thing. All right, file sharing. Most of you know what file sharing is. You've probably done it without really thinking about it. That's just if you take an MP3 and share that file over via email or download or wherever, that is considered file sharing. Okay. Napster, just know, is one of the earliest file sharing websites. So Napster is basically just the earliest. In my day, it was LimeWire, which is a little past Napster's time, but Napster is one of the initial file sharing websites, which is typically illegal because you are taking other people's copyrighted music and sharing it on your own. So Napster is one of the first examples of that. Then you have copyright infringement, which of course Napster is doing through file sharing. Just know that anytime that you download a piece of music for free, typically that is going to be considered copyright infringement because somebody owns the rights to that music and you are not respecting that copyright. Okay. Blanket licensing. Blanket licensing basically refers to kind of what BMI was doing with just blanket licensing all of the music at once as opposed to paying for individual songs. So that's more of a ASCAP BMI. kind of consideration. Direct sales versus indirect sales. Remember that the broadcast radio is going to make money from indirect sales. You hear advertisements for products that you buy, and then those products that you buy indirectly pay for broadcast radio. So that's what that's getting at. PMRC that stands for Parental Music Resource Center, or Parents Music Resource Center. And that is the reason that whenever you see an explicit label on CDs, like when it says explicit or content advisory, not for kids or whatever, the explicit label on music comes from the PMRC. That was a political agency headed up by Tipper Gore in the 1980s. And so they were trying to censor quite a bit of music. So PMRC, Parental Music Resource Center, they're the reason you have explicit warning labels on records. RIAA, that is the Recording Industry Association of America. And they are responsible for both going after copyright infringement. So if you ever download a song illegally and you get in legal trouble for it, typically the RIAA is probably who sued you. The other thing that they do that is the more fun part of what they do is they're the ones who certify when albums go gold or platinum or what have you. And they also, whenever we did that game about, I think this was 2 Fridays ago, whenever we had that game about who the top 10 albums are, they're the people that decide who had the most album sales. Like I said, they do decide who goes platinum and gold and certified and all that. So they also track record sales. Heinrich Hertz, all you really need to know about him, pretty obvious, just that he invented the Hertzian wave. Okay, so Hertzian wave used in a lot of stuff since, but just know that Heinrich Hertz is the Hertzian wave inventor. And so that sort of allows a lot of sound to travel over the radio. I believe that I believe we're in chapter 6 now, which is the radio portion. And then we'll get into chapter 4, which is magazines, in a minute. Lee DeForest is actually the inventor of the Audion. So that's those two terms pretty much go together if you want to just point an arrow from Lee DeForest to Audion. And I do think his name is spelled Lee DeForest, but you'll kind of get the idea anyway. Lee DeForest is the inventor of the Audion, which was like this glass bulb thing that was one of the first very primitive radio stations. All right. Okay. In any case, KDKA, you already know, is one of the first commercial broadcast radio stations. RCA, NBC, CBS, ABC. What I want you to know about that is who is associated with those networks. So remember, David Sarnoff is RCA and NBC. William Paley is CBS. And then Edward Noble would be the guy that headed up ABC for a while. Edward Noble having got his fortune from Lifesavers Candy. He was an heir to that fortune, I believe. Okay. WEAF was the first radio station that actually played commercials, and that was in New York. So WEAF, know that that is the first radio station that ever actually played advertising. Samuel Morse obviously invented Morse code, so that should be pretty straightforward. Samuel Morse is known for Morse code. Guglielmo Marconi is known for a couple of things. For one, American Marconi was a very, very big radio manufacturer in the early days. So Guglielmo Marconi often gets referred to as the father of radio. So that's one thing that I want you to remember about him. Often known as the father of radio. The other thing is that he was one of the first people to produce a wireless broadcast. I forget the exact year, but it was America's Cup Race, which is a horse race that he broadcasted by wireless. And that was a big deal at the time, that he was able to transmit sound over a large airway without any wires being involved. Okay, the Radio Act of 1912, that is going to be related to, that's when the Navy kind of took over a lot of different radio broadcast. That's also when they decided that since radio frequencies were kind of out in the public, there's something that everybody has access to. They were trying to determine, okay, who gets to have licensing for a radio station? So we cannot have just anybody and their mom on every single radio wave. That's going to lead to a lot of interference. And so the Radio Act of 1912 was when the government stepped in and said, we're going to license who can or cannot own a radio station. It also led down the line to, again, like I said, the Navy was going to take over a lot of radio stations for a limited amount of time. Okay, Reginald Fessenden, he invented the AM format radio, or not format radio, but the amplitude modulation way of delivering radio. So anytime that you tune to an AM station in your car, that is thanks to Reginald Fessenden. Gordon McClendon was actually in Dallas. I think the radio station he worked at was KLIF. But he is known for inventing format radio, specifically in this case, top 40 music format radio. So format radio meaning, in this context, you know, whether it's country or rap or hip hop or anything like that. Gordon McClendon was famous for inventing the top 40 format. Okay, and then you have payola. Payola is basically this idea that it's also sometimes called drug-ola, because people would pay with drugs. It's also called Victrola after the Victor Talking Machine Company. But in any case, payola is when somebody pays you to play their song on the radio. And so Alan Freed was caught for that. Alan Freed being the rock and roll guy that we talked about a little bit earlier. He was caught for that and sentenced to prison for a few years. He was caught playing records based on both payola and drugola. But payola is a mixture of the words payment and then Victrola, which was a Victor Talking Machine Company product that played records, obviously. And if you were engaging in payola, that meant that you were paying radio stations to play your music. So you were kind of cheating your way into the top 40. Then you have the Communication Act of 1934, which establishes what is called the Federal Communication Commission, or the FCC. And so that establishes Federal Communication Commission, as which is called the FCC. And the FCC is still responsible at this point for pretty much determining who has the license to own radio stations. FCC today is going to regulate content. They're going to be the people that if somebody swears or if there's a Super Bowl mishap, obviously with Rihanna last night, there really wasn't one, but referring to the Justin Timberlake, Janet Jackson Super Bowl from quite a few years ago, if something like that happens, they're going to fine whatever station aired something like that. In the early days of them, though, they really were just trying to figure out who got to own radio stations, who got to broadcast over using radio stations. Okay, with Edwin Armstrong. Edwin Armstrong is the guy that had the patent fight with David Sarnoff for quite a while, because he worked at the same company when he developed frequency modulation, or FM. So Edwin H. Armstrong is known for inventing FM, but there is kind of a sad story, like we talked about in class, to go along with that, where Edwin H. Armstrong ends up sadly dying by suicide because of the patent, sort of the legal battles over who invented FM. Eventually, after his death, he does get credited with inventing FM, but unfortunately, that is posthumously after his death, but he is credited with inventing FM. Narrowcasting. Narrowcasting refers to the idea that you are able with radio, especially with format radio. So if somebody is listening to a country music station, you might have better luck selling them, like, let's say, hunting equipment. If somebody's listening to a hip hop station, you might have better luck selling them sneakers. If somebody's listening, like I do, to an alternative rock station, you might have better luck selling them like flannel gear or something. But the idea of narrowcasting is that the radio kind of lends itself to, if you have a certain type of format, then you can tailor your advertising to that market. So it's easier to target certain demographics using the radio because you already have it to where you have this segmented audience that you can kind of sell specific products to. Cross ownership is just referencing the fact that you can own both a radio and a TV station within the same market. So it used to be that if you owned a radio station in Dallas, Texas, you were not able to own a TV station within Dallas, Texas. That changed through several different acts. There was the Telecommunications Act of 1996 that deregulated quite a bit. And then you were able to own a couple of different radio and television stations within the same market. So cross ownership is owning two different types of broadcast stations within the same market. That's what that refers to, radio or TV. War of the Worlds, that's when Orson Welles, so Orson Welles being the famous director of Citizen Kane, also the guy that creates this War of the Worlds fake alien invasion broadcast. And for the purposes of this chapter, just know that the War of the Worlds did freak some people out to the point that Orson Welles got arrested for that broadcast because people thought that it was a real thing that was happening, and therefore he is declared kind of a public nuisance, or he disturbs the peace with his War of the Worlds broadcast because everybody starts thinking there's an alien invasion, right? So that's what War of the Worlds is about. NPR. Somebody ask a question? I'm sorry, I can't hear. Okay. If somebody is asking a question, if you would post it in the chat, I can't really hear you very well at the moment. But NPR, National Public Radio, that's the first what's called public radio station. And so public broadcast radio station. So it does not carry any advertising. It's mostly used for news and education. So that's what NPR is. Radio formats. Let me just check real quick to see if the chat, did somebody post in the chat? Let's see it. Okay, so I'm guessing nobody's posting in the chat or asking questions. Sorry. Radio formats, just know some of the most popular radio formats. For instance, these days, country is pretty far up there. Now we know that so that was radio. Now we're going to get into chapter 4 stuff. So this is going way back to magazines. I know it probably feels like forever. This is actually only the first chapter we went over for this particular test, but if you've forgotten this, we'll go over it. McClure's magazine. Just know that McClure's magazine was one of the first magazines to have what are called muckrakers. Remember muckrakers being some of the first investigative journalists, and FDR and Teddy Roosevelt don't really like them a whole lot. They're referred to as muckrakers because they dig up dirt on people, essentially. And there was the man with the muckrake, that being kind of the historical reference there. That story about a man that's, you know, cleaning up, I think muck was a term for poop on farms and stuff, and he's cleaning that up in this kind of short story that's being referenced there. The New Yorker and Time, what I want you to know about those magazines, the New Yorker is for a very specifically defined audience. The New Yorker is very specifically for people who love reading. It's a lot of poetry and art and kind of these comic strips that are a little bit weird. So the New Yorker has a very specific target demographic that they're going after, whereas magazines like Time, Time is owned by a man named Henry Lucci, so is Sports Illustrated, so is Life magazine. But Time magazine is an example of a magazine that is very broad in who it is trying to target. There's not really a specific demographic they're after. They just sort of want everybody to be able to read it. And it's basically a magazine that you shouldn't only take 30 minutes and get caught up on the news. Okay. Women. Just know that women were the main target of most magazines. especially Ladies Home Journal, even McClure's. Most people who were buying magazines, like we talked about, sort of like books, women were definitely the target market of reading material back in the 19th century and early days. Probably still, but women are one of the biggest demographic markets for magazines. Postal Act of 1879 is basically the act that made it cheaper to send magazines through the mail. So for a while, it was newspapers got a certain tax break for being sent through the mail, and magazines, if you were subscribing to a magazine, you were not only paying for the magazine, you were also paying for all of the postage on that magazine. The Postal Act of 1879 made it to where you were no longer paying all of the postage to receive a magazine in the mail. And so that made magazines a lot cheaper for the consumer, and it meant that a lot more people started subscribing to magazines in 1879 when that was passed. Muckrakers I've already talked about, so just know that they are associated with McClure's magazine. That's just kind of a reminder there. Magazine reader demographics, again, women, going to be the biggest one. As far as the Saturday Evening Post, that was the first truly national medium, according to your book. That was the first truly national medium because most people in the country at the time were subscribed to the Saturday Evening Post. So this is before radio, this is before TV. Most people were getting a lot of their sort of monthly news from the Saturday Evening Post. Newspapers, remember, are kind of a local thing. If you live in Boston or if you live in Philadelphia, you're getting different newspapers because you have different news kind of concerns, but the Saturday Evening Post was going to most of the country all at once. So it was the first truly national medium. All right, Ladies Home Journal. I want you to know that the Ladies Home Journal is very well known for fighting against patent medicine ads. In fact, the Ladies Home Journal is one of the reasons that we have an FDA, or a Food and Drug Administration, at all. So patent medicine ads were the ads for medicines that were basically mostly alcohol. They really didn't have a whole lot of medicinal value to them. And so Ladies Home Journal said, we don't want to carry advertisements for this anymore. And so they're pretty well known for that reason. All right, consumer versus trade versus company magazines. Consumer magazines are magazines that are like a Sports Illustrated, like a Time, like a Vogue. Those are the magazines that you're going to see on newsstands. Those are for the general public. Those are just general interest, even Game Informer. Consumer magazines are exactly what they sound like. They're for consumers. Then you have trade magazines, trade or professional magazines, which are going to be, so for instance, in my case, as a professor, I sometimes read a magazine called Inside Higher Ed. I think Columbia Journalism Review is a magazine that I'll sometimes read just because I'm a journalism professor, and so they go over journalism content. And then company magazines are going to be magazines that are released by a company. So like a Ford Motors would release a magazine that talks all about the new developments with Ford cars and trucks and all of that good stuff. So consumer magazine is whatever's on a newsstand. A trade magazine is somebody with a particular job is going to be reading that magazine for tips. And then stuff that's going on in their profession. And then a company magazine is going to be, like I said, Ford. It could also be Chevy or Honda, or I don't know why I always go with car manufacturers, but company magazines are magazines that are literally produced by a company that makes different products that it wants to kind of talk about. And usually its employees are going to be the only ones reading those magazines. Okay, Jamie Thomas. Remember, Jamie Thomas was sued for copyright infringement because she downloaded, I forget the number of songs, but it was like somewhere between 9 to 12. It wasn't a whole lot of songs, but she was sued successfully, and the Supreme Court upheld it for 6 figures. So it was like 100,000 or 500,000. The specific amount is not necessarily all that integral to what you need to know for your test, but you need to know that Jamie Thomas was made an example of, essentially, by the RIAA and the people who owned the rights to the music that she downloaded. They were basically trying to say, if you download music, Jamie Thomas is what can happen to you. So she was kind of made an example of. Whether that's fair or not is, for you to decide, but that is what happened. So that's what I need you to know about her. Motown, obviously associated with Berry Gordy. So if you forget who invented Motown, Berry Gordy is one of the people. I don't believe this is on your test, but the Supremes are one of the bands that Motown was producing at the time. Rock and roll, remember Alan Freed, the guy that was involved in some payola scandals, was very much associated with rock and roll radio. High fidelity just means good signal. That's one of the sort of developments in radio technology. And so that was one of the things that made rock and roll and Motown a lot more palatable, was that if you had a high fidelity radio system, those types of formats would come in a lot better. Tech innovations in recordings. So let me go back to, I still have this up. Yeah, is this chapter 5 or chapter 6? Let me remember. I think it's chapter 6 that I want you to look at as far as tech innovations in recordings. Let me see. Chapter 6. Okay. That's not it. Let's see. But in any case, tech innovations and recordings, one of the things I want you to look at, I guess it was chapter 5, but there should be a part of your PowerPoint that goes through, like Sony had the Walkman in the 1980s, which was that portable tape player. You had the iPod, obviously, in the 2000s. And then you get the iPhone, and then you get to, MP3 players and stuff like that. So that's the tech innovations that I want you to kind of refer to. Concerts versus record sales. So as far as, let me get rid of no decades, big inventions. This should actually go next to, so if you see this on your, I'm going to fix this on the review when I'm going to re-upload it, but no decades, big inventions, no kind of the decades that each of those inventions came from. So like CDs came from the 1980s. Sony's Walkman was actually released in 1979. Even though it is associated with the 80s. You have the 2000s with the Apple iPhone and iPod and all that. So tech innovations and recordings is where I need you to know the decades and big inventions. So I'll fix that and re-upload it to D2L. Concerts versus record sales. Can somebody tell me which one most artists rely on these days? No? Okay. Well, somebody posted in the chat. Concerts, yes. Correct. Most artists these days are going to rely on concerts for their revenue. Record sales are not really cutting it, especially with all of the downloading that goes on. Nielsen and Arbitron ratings. So basically know that Arbitron used to be for just radio, and then Nielsen bought them out. And so Nielsen used to be only for TV. And now, these days, Nielsen is for everything. Nielsen owns all of the survey and rating information for both radio and television. And criticism, how they work, and criticism of how they work. They don't go out to as many Spanish speakers as they do English speakers, even though they are now written in both English and Spanish. So they're a little bit better there. They usually, if you have the time to fill out a Nielsen survey, chances are you're not working 18 hours and poor, so they kind of overrepresent a middle class market. So there's a couple other criticisms out there in your book, but those are kind of the main ones as far as how those surveys work and why people don't always find them to be accurate. Where people listen to the radio. These statistics might have changed slightly over the years, but it's still true that the #1 place that people listen to radio is in their cars. The second best place to listen to radio is at home, and then the third best place is going to be at work. So whenever you see that pie chart that's in your book that says where people listen to radio, it's going to mention homes, cars, and work, and pretty much it's in the same order. So I don't need you to remember the specific statistics on that one, but it's in the same order that your book puts it in. Orson Welles, just know that he was associated with War of the Worlds, so that's just a reminder one again. Satellite and HD radio. So like XM radio or Sirius radio, I believe now it's just Sirius XM, more concentration of ownership. It's mostly Sirius XM that does any sort of satellite or HD satellite radio. Satellite radio is paid for by subscriptions, remember. And then HD radio, which is actually slightly different from satellite radio. HD radio is the reason that if you have a car that tells you this is the song an artist playing on the radio, that's HD radio or high definition radio. And then you have Martin Block, who I believe was responsible for the New York Ballroom playlist. Let me see, Martin Block. I'm actually going to have to look Martin Block up because I forget exactly without looking at my notes. So this is an example of the professor, despite the fact I've taught this like 5 or 6 times every once in a while. Oh, he invented the term disc jockey. So Martin Block sort of invented the idea of a DJ who would sort of introduce music to you and tell you about the music and where it came from and all of that. So Martin Block sort of invented the idea of the DJ. And as you see, professors also need reviews sometimes as well. Okay, so I am going to stop record, or not stop recording, but I'm going to go back into showing all of you if you have any questions. If you don't have any questions, then I am going to stop the recording soon and hope that most of you have enough review for your test at this point. So if there are no questions, please stick around if you do have questions. If there are no questions, though, you are free to go. Okay. Let's see. Is there one question? Are we taking online or what? No, we're taking in person. I should be able to return on Wednesday with a mask. That'll be more than 5 days since my onset of symptoms. Yeah, we're taking it in person as usual. It's just I had to quarantine for today and likely tomorrow, but that's not this class is concerned. Okay. Other questions? So yeah, remember to have an 882E Scantron and a number 2 pencil because we are taking it in person still. I'll remind you on D2L. Other questions from the people still in here? Or are you all just asleep and you forgot to? Okay, let's see, one more question. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, Alex, in that case, you would just need to talk to them. That's not something that I handle. I just send the test over once you've done everything to get that set up. So you'll have to set that up yourself, okay? All right. Other questions? Izzy, Sierra, Ariana, who else is in here? Hannah, Caroline. If y'all don't have any questions, please log off so I know that I can't. Okay. I don't either. Yeah, okay. Well, in that case, just whoever doesn't have questions, go ahead and log off. And then once everybody's logged off, I'll stop the recording. But I mean, until then, I'm kind of confused. All right. So Hannah, Ariana, Sierra, do you guys have any questions? Are you asleep? Okay. You guys okay? Here you're highlighted. I don't know why that is. Okay, unless somebody says something within the next probably 30 seconds, I'm likely going to stop the recording. If I can find where to stop the recording. Fairness. Stop sharing. And then how do I stop the recording? Here we go.